She was stopped in front of the entrance because she looked poor. At the velvet turnstile of the Argenta Club, the bouncer didn't even check the list. Private event, he grunted. Behind her, the polished elites laughed. Maybe the kitchen is over there, one woman said mockingly. She didn't answer, just showed her VIP pass and walked right through the mockery, into the fire. But when they found out who she was, they were shocked. It started with the velvet rope. The kind that didn't just separate the sidewalk from the entrance, but the ordinary from the untouchable. Club Argent was the kind of place that didn't post its prices because if you had to ask, you didn't belong. On Saturday nights, the line snaked around the block, all sharp heels, sharper suits, and the sort of laughter that came too easily from lips stained in imported gloss. Nora stood alone, tucked under the yellow halo of a streetlight. She wore a simple black dress that had seen better days and a pair of scuffed ankle boots. Her coat was a thrift store find, oversized and draping her small frame like a forgotten curtain. No jewelry, no shimmering clutch, no visible brand names screaming their pedigree. She was a shadow among neon. When she reached the front of the line, the bouncer, brick-built, all jaw and narrowed eyes, didn't even bother looking at the clipboard. He simply held up a meaty hand and shook his head. Private event, he said, voice low and final. I'm on the list, Nora said, quiet but firm. The woman behind her snickered, loud enough to be a slap. She was platinum blonde, dripping in Cartier and self-importance, hanging onto the arm of a man who smelled like expensive cologne and worse decisions. Sure you are, sweetheart, the woman drawled, her voice dripping condescension. Maybe check the kitchen entrance. A ripple of laughter moved through the line, sharp, effortless cruelty, practiced by people who never missed a meal unless it was on purpose. Nora said nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down at her boots or wrap her arms tighter around herself. She just stood there, a stillness in the chaos, looking the bouncer dead in the eye like she was daring him to really see her. The bouncer, unsettled by her unwavering gaze, shifted on his feet. He looked at the clipboard now, more out of reflex than intention. Name after name, then, there it was. Nora Winslow. Cleared for VIP access. The bouncer's face twisted for a split second, confusion, then irritation, but rules were rules. He unclipped the velvet rope and stepped aside. Go ahead, he muttered. Nora walked forward without a glance at the sneering crowd still waiting outside. The platinum blonde's laughter died in her throat. The man next to her whistled low under his breath, watching Nora disappear into the golden, pulsing light of Club Argent. Inside, it was another world entirely. Chandelier crystals threw shattered rainbows across marble floors. Bartenders in tailored vests mixed cocktails that cost more than Nora's entire outfit. A DJ in a booth made of glass spun tracks that vibrated through the bone. Eyes followed her, not because she belonged, but because she didn't. She was a crack in the polished surface, a question mark in a world that hated unanswered questions. Nora ignored them all. She moved toward the back of the room where an installation was being set up, a sleek, minimalist display space surrounded by velvet ropes and guarded like a fortress. A handful of art collectors in designer gowns and sleek tuxedos hovered nearby, sipping aged whiskey and murmuring in low, bored voices about investments and provenance. They barely looked at her. If they had, they might have noticed the small portfolio tucked under her arm, or the steady calm in her step, or the glint in her eyes, like she was about to turn their whole world upside down. The display was called Emergence, a curated showing for select up-and-coming artists. Though anyone with half a brain knew what that really meant, the children of patrons, the wives of venture capitalists, the bored heirs looking for a hobby. The kind of artists who painted with one hand while texting agents with the other. Nora drifted toward the small, white-draped tables where portfolios were stacked, waiting to be judged. She laid hers down carefully, between a pile of loud abstract pieces and a glossy set of prints already signed with flowing, expensive signatures. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. A wiry man in a sleek navy suit, Carter Blake, curator of the event, was holding court near the entrance to the exhibition space. He wore a tie pin shaped like a dagger and looked at everyone like they were things to be sorted, useful, irrelevant, disposable. Nora watched as he nodded indulgently to a trio of women in jewel-toned gowns, their laughter syrupy and calculated. He moved on, pausing at portfolios with dramatic sighs or murmured approvals. When he finally reached hers, he didn't even bother hiding it, a dismissive glance at her thrift store coat slung over a chair, the worn boots poking out from under her table. Then, a lazy, almost pitying flip through her portfolio. 1, 2, 3 pages. And he froze. Nora kept her face blank, even as she saw it happen, the small tightening around his mouth, the way his eyes sharpened, anchoring to her work with the sudden intensity of a man seeing something he hadn't expected. He glanced up, properly this time, studying her as if for the first time. The people around them kept chattering, clinking their glasses, laughing at things that weren't funny. They hadn't noticed the slight shift in the air. But Nora had. And so had Carter Blake. He cleared his throat. Loudly enough to silence a few nearby conversations. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising a hand, his voice smooth and commanding. "It appears we have an unexpected gem among us tonight." Heads turned lazily, curious. Smirks formed before they even knew what they were looking at. "Miss?" Carter looked at her for confirmation. "Nora Winslow," she said, voice calm, steady. "Miss Winslow," he repeated, gesturing grandly, "has brought something truly authentic. A word like a knife through the room's false polish." He held up one of her pieces, a raw, powerful painting of a city skyline bleeding into twilight, every brushstroke alive with aching, hungry color. There was a ripple through the crowd. An uncomfortable stirring. Some leaned in. Others whispered behind manicured hands. And for the first time that night, Nora wasn't invisible. She was inevitable. The applause was hesitant at first, an awkward smattering of polite claps from a few older patrons who thought it was safer to agree than to think. But as Carter placed the painting onto the easel at the center of the room, the murmurs grew louder, thornier. "Who is she? Is she even represented? I've never heard of her." Nora stood silent through it all. She could feel the eyes slicing across her like knives, evaluating, doubting, resenting. She was a glitch in their curated night, a storm cloud over their well-practiced smiles. One of the women who had laughed at her outside, the one in the emerald dress, clicked her tongue and leaned toward a man in a velvet blazer. "Amateur work," she whispered, loud enough for Nora to hear. "Tragic, really? Thinks she's the next Basquiat." Nora's lips barely moved, but the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly. Let them talk, she thought. They were all so used to noise, they didn't recognize the power of silence. Carter, meanwhile, wasn't playing for the crowd. He turned back to Nora, eyebrows raised. "Are you free for a conversation?" he asked, words careful but edged with genuine urgency. "Of course," Nora said. He led her away from the cluster of tables, past the curtain into a smaller, private gallery room where serious discussions were held, where deals were made. The walls here were lined with understated, absurdly expensive art, a Rothko, a Herring, a muted Pollock. For a long moment, they stood facing each other under the cool glow of the overhead track lights. "You realize," Carter said slowly, "this piece could sell tonight." Nora simply tilted her head. "You'd need a number. A price." There was a challenge in his voice now, a barely veiled test. He still thought she was a nobody in a borrowed dress, probably desperate to sell for whatever crumbs he offered. Nora's voice was even when she answered. $500,000. Carter blinked, as if she'd slapped him. And when she didn't laugh, didn't stammer or backpedal, his face shifted, faint irritation, but also a flicker of respect. A dealer recognized value, and he recognized something else, too, certainty. "Ambitious?" he said, lips twisting into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's worth it," Nora said simply. He studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll see what we can do," he said. Back out in the main room, word was spreading like spilled wine. Faces tightened. The elite could smell it. Something was happening they hadn't scripted. And for the first time in their carefully polished lives, they weren't in control. The music inside Club Argent had shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. Gone was the casual thump of background beats. Now the bass rolled low and steady, like a warning underfoot. People clustered in tighter groups, glancing toward the small easel where Nora's painting stood under a single halo of white light. She could feel it, the change. They weren't laughing anymore. Carter returned quickly, smoothing down his tie, a little breathless. His voice dropped into the low, slippery tone of a man brokering something far above his pay grade. "We have an offer," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "$250. Nora didn't even blink. "No." He looked startled. "$250,000 is." "I said no," she repeated, gentler this time, as if she were explaining something to a child. Her gaze moved past him to where a small group was gathering, their polished shoes and practiced smiles giving away their intentions. Buyers. Serious ones. A man with silver temples and a navy pinstriped suit, Robert Lang, if memory served, old money, art hoarder, ego in a tailored jacket, approached first. "Miss Winslow," he said, as if they'd already been properly introduced. "Astonishing work. May I have a private word?" Nora smiled slightly. "You can have a public one." He chuckled like she'd made a charming joke. "I'd like to acquire this piece. 300,000. Right now. Full payment tonight." Carter's mouth opened, ready to jump in, but Nora raised one hand and he fell silent. She stepped closer, almost close enough to smell the bergamot and old wealth on Robert Lang's suit. 300 for this one," she said softly. "But it's not the only one I brought." A murmur rolled through the room. "A second painting? More?" Eyes lit up with the greedy shine of prospectors. "I'll offer 350 for both, unseen," Robert said quickly, desperate to secure his place first. A woman in a backless red gown, someone's gallery director, no doubt, cut in sharply. 400. And I want first right of refusal on any future works." Nora just stood there, watching them scramble, offering them no expressions, no encouragement. She wasn't begging. She was choosing. And it scared them more than anything. From somewhere near the bar, the platinum blonde from earlier, the one who had mocked her at the door, watched the scene unfold. Her jaw tightened, the hand on her flute of champagne trembling slightly. Nora caught her eye for just a moment and tilted her head in the smallest, coldest nod. "You were right," her look seemed to say. "I'm not on the list you thought I needed to be on. And I never was." The offers kept rising, numbers thrown out like lifelines in a rising tide. 450. 475. $500,000. The room pulsed with it, the raw, frantic energy of people who couldn't stand the thought of losing. It was no longer about the painting. It was about power, ownership, about being the first to say, "I knew her before the world did." Carter hovered nearby, his hands wringing invisibly at his sides. He was trying to catch Nora's eye, desperate to be the one to orchestrate the sale and take his commission like a vulture feeding. But Nora had already decided. She turned toward the crowd, voice low but carrying. "I'm not selling tonight." The words dropped like a bomb. You could almost hear the collective inhale, the disbelief, the outrage. Not selling? Not after all this? Carter stepped forward, panic flashing across his carefully managed face. "Miss Winslow, this is a rare opportunity. You won't find better offers." Nora smiled, a slow, almost sad thing. "I don't need the money," she said simply. Silence wrapped itself around the room like a noose. She walked back to the easel, tracing a finger lightly along the edge of her canvas. It was a gesture of ownership, of intimacy. This was hers. No velvet rope, no handshake deal could cheapen it. One of the older men near the bar, someone whose family name was etched onto museum wings, narrowed his eyes. "Then why come here?" he demanded. His voice was sharper now, brittle with wounded pride. "Why parade yourself around if not to sell?" Nora lifted her gaze and met his squarely. "To see if you could tell the difference," she said. The words stung in a way they couldn't fully understand. Not yet. Behind her, a man in a black turtleneck, quiet until now, stepped forward. He wasn't dressed like the others. No flashing watch. No designer shoes. But Nora knew him. And more importantly, they would recognize him soon enough. Someone whispered it first. James Weller. The name cut through the murmur like a blade. James Weller. Tech billionaire. The reclusive founder of Viridian Systems. The man who collected emerging artists the way others collected rare books or vintage cars, and paid absurd prices to do so. Weller nodded once at Nora, a glint of amusement in his eyes. We've met before, he said casually, hands in his pockets. Another ripple through the room. Suddenly, everyone was recalibrating, reassessing. If Weller knew her, she wasn't some random street artist. She was connected. Important. And then Nora delivered the final blow. I invested in Viridian early, she said. Calm. Even. Inevitable. I'm one of its largest private shareholders. The silence after her words was unlike anything Nora had ever heard. Not the heavy, judging quiet she had felt walking into Club Argent. This was something different. This was the sound of a room full of people realizing they had just treated a millionaire, a power, like a beggar at their gates. A red flush crept up Carter's neck, blooming hot under his starched collar. He tried to recover, forcing a brittle laugh. Well, he said too loudly. Then perhaps we could discuss a private showing? We'd be honored to host you. No, Nora said, her voice even. She didn't owe them her presence. Not anymore. James Weller stepped closer to her, still wearing that half smirk that said he was enjoying every second of this. If you're still interested, he said casually, I have a gallery space in Tribeca. We could arrange something more fitting. Nora considered it for a moment, then nodded. Maybe, she said, non-committal. She wasn't hungry for their attention. That was the difference now, they were the ones chasing. Behind them, the platinum blonde woman, her earlier mockery now a heavy stone around her neck, stared open-mouthed. Her boyfriend or husband or whatever he was, leaned in and whispered something urgent, eyes darting from Nora to Weller. Deals were collapsing and reforming in real time. Invitations that had been prepared for others were suddenly being readdressed in their heads. The entire social ecosystem inside Club Argent was shuddering, desperate to adapt. But Nora didn't move. She let them squirm. One by one, the partygoers shifted. Some tried to smile at her. Others gave her wide, awkward bursts like she might explode. Carter muttered something about a drink on the house, which Nora ignored completely. James Weller finally chuckled under his breath. You enjoy making them uncomfortable, he said, more observation than question. Nora turned her eyes toward him, thoughtful. I enjoy seeing the truth, she said. People show you who they are when they think you're beneath them. He nodded, something approving in his expression. They do. Around them, the music thrummed back to life, louder now, covering the broken pieces of the night. But the center of gravity had shifted. Nora Winslow wasn't just another artist anymore. She wasn't the charity case they could mock or mold. She was the storm they hadn't seen coming, and she wasn't done yet. The lights dimmed slightly as a new set of music vibrated through the club, but Nora barely heard it. She was watching the ripple effect she'd caused, people realigning themselves, jockeying for relevance. It was almost funny. Almost. She was about to slip away, craving the cold night air, when a voice stopped her. Soft. Disbelieving. Nora? She turned. At the edge of the crowd, near the wall where forgotten guests clung to shadows, stood a woman in a simple blue dress. Brown hair tucked behind her ears, sensible shoes, a threadbare handbag clutched to her chest like a shield. She looked completely out of place here. Nora blinked, then felt a jolt of memory so strong it nearly staggered her. Marcy? She whispered. The woman smiled shyly. I thought it was you. Marcy Thompson. From the old neighborhood. They'd grown up on the same cracked sidewalks, swapping half-eaten sandwiches and sharing battered library books. Marcy, who had once stood outside Nora's apartment door during the winter blackout, shivering but offering half of her last can of soup without hesitation. Nora hadn't seen her in almost a decade. Before she could stop herself, Nora stepped forward and pulled Marcy into a hug. The embrace was clumsy, tight with years of survival pressed between them. When they pulled apart, Marcy looked her over, wide-eyed. "You look different," she said, smiling. "But still you." Nora laughed under her breath. "You, too." Marcy's gaze flickered nervously toward the glittering mass of bodies swirling behind them. I work coat check here. Just part-time," she said, cheeks flushing. "I saw you come in, but I thought, no way could that be Nora Winslow, not here." Nora's heart squeezed in her chest. Coat check. Probably making minimum wage. Probably running between 2 or 3 jobs just to survive. Nora suddenly saw her night differently, not as some grand personal victory, but as something lonelier. All this money, all this success, and the people who had mattered most were still fighting for scraps. Without hesitation, Nora slipped her hand into her coat pocket, found the slim leather envelope she had tucked there earlier, just in case. She pressed it into Marcy's hand. "What's this?" Marcy asked, confused. "Something overdue," Nora said softly. "Open it when you're home." Marcy started to protest, but Nora squeezed her fingers gently, silencing her. Then she smiled, truly smiled, and said, "Good things come around. Sometimes it just takes a while." Behind her, the elites of Club Argent kept spinning in their frantic little orbit. But for the first time all night, Nora felt completely, beautifully centered. Marcy finished her shift just before 2 in the morning, her feet aching and her back sore from hours of standing. The night had blurred by after seeing Nora, every coat she handed back a fog, every "thank you" from the glittering guests sounding hollow. She rode the subway home, the envelope burning a hole in her pocket the whole way. Her apartment was small, a crumbling third-floor walk-up above a laundromat, but it was hers. She kicked off her shoes, tossed her keys onto the counter, and finally sat at the wobbly kitchen table. For a long moment she just stared at the envelope. It was heavy. Thick paper, stitched edges. Not the kind of thing people like her ever received. With trembling fingers she opened it. Inside was a check. At first, her mind couldn't process the number. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, held it closer under the flickering overhead light. $250,000. Made out to Marcy Thompson. In the memo line, scrawled in Nora's careful handwriting, were 4 simple words. "For everything you gave." Marcy pressed a hand to her mouth, a choked sound escaping her throat. Tears welled up fast, hot and overwhelming, blurring the world. She thought of the winters they'd survived, huddling in stairwells when the heat went out. Of Nora slipping her half of a peanut butter sandwich when Marcy's family had nothing. Of whispered dreams between them of something better, something bigger. Marcy had never asked for anything back. She had never expected it. And yet, here it was, Nora's way of saying, "I didn't forget. I never forgot." The money would change everything. She could pay off her mother's medical bills. Move into a place with real walls and heat that didn't sputter out in January. Maybe even go back to school like she had once dared to dream. Through her tears, Marcy laughed, a breathless, broken sound, then clutched the check to her chest. Outside, the city hummed its sleepless lullaby, indifferent and sprawling. But inside that tiny apartment, hope bloomed fresh and fierce. Because someone who remembered what it was like to have nothing had finally come back for her. And it changed everything. Nora slipped out of Club Argent without fanfare. No bodyguards, no fanfare, no flashing cameras. Just the sound of her boots hitting the wet pavement, and the faint echo of bass fading behind her. The cool night air wrapped around her, crisp and real. She pulled her thrifted coat tighter around her, even though she could afford better now, leather, cashmere, designer, but this one reminded her of something truer, who she had been. Who she still was, under all the polish. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Carter. We should talk. There's big interest after tonight. Galleries asking. Let's make it happen. Nora stared at the screen for a moment, then powered the phone off. She wasn't interested in being managed. Further down the street, she saw James Weller leaning casually against a black town car, arms folded, watching the night roll on. He gave a short nod when he caught her eye. Most people would be inside, soaking it up, he said when she approached. I'm not most people, Nora said, smiling faintly. He laughed under his breath, a sound rough with approval. No. You're not. There was a pause, easy and unforced. You know, Weller added. They'll come crawling now. Galleries, investors, reporters. They'll want to own a piece of you. Nora tilted her head back, looking up at the night sky barely visible between the skyscrapers. Let them want, she said simply. He studied her, then opened the car door but didn't climb in yet. You have plans? She thought about it. I think, Nora said slowly, I want to buy the old library where we used to go after school. Fix it up. Open it again. Weller's eyebrows lifted slightly. A library, he repeated, like it was the most radical thing he'd heard all night. Nora smiled wider now, real and unguarded. Yeah. A place where kids like me, and Marcy, can find something bigger than what's outside their windows. Weller gave a low whistle, then shook his head in admiration. You're dangerous, he said. In the best way. Nora laughed, a soft, real sound that startled even her. Maybe tonight hadn't been about proving herself to the crowd at Argent. Maybe it had never been about them at all. It was about showing herself that no matter how much the world glittered and sneered and tried to erase her, she was still standing. Not by accident. Not by permission. By choice. She tucked her hands into her pockets and turned away from the blinding lights, walking slowly down the empty street towards something better. Something hers. A week later, Nora stood in front of a crumbling brick building on the corner of Stanton and Ridge. The old library? The windows were boarded up, graffiti curling across the faded stone like bruises. A rusted chain hung from the front doors, swinging slightly in the late autumn wind. Nora ran a hand across the rough surface of the door, feeling the deep grooves carved over years, by time, by weather, by neglect. She could still see flashes of her younger self here. Skinny knees poking out of too short jeans, a backpack weighed down with borrowed books, Marcy racing her up the stairs, laughing breathless. Inside those doors had once been a world that didn't care how poor you were, or what your shoes looked like, or whether you knew the right people. Inside had been possibility. And now, it would be again. She heard the crunch of footsteps behind her and turned to see Marcy approaching, bundled in a thick new coat, her cheeks pink from the cold but smiling wide. You sure about this? Marcy asked, glancing up at the battered facade. Nora nodded. Already made the offer. The city accepted. It's ours now. Marcy laughed, a sound full of wonder. Ours. Not some slick developer. Not another high-rise. Not another club with velvet ropes and bouncers deciding who mattered. It would be a library again, a place where kids could come after school, where teenagers could sit in the back corner and dream bigger dreams than the streets would allow. Marcy reached into her pocket and pulled out a key, the first key to the new beginning. She pressed it into Nora's hand. Nora closed her fingers around it slowly, the cold metal biting into her palm, grounding her. This wasn't a painting that would hang in some billionaire's hallway. This wasn't another auction or headline. This was the real work. The work that mattered. You ready? Marcy asked. Nora smiled. I've been ready for a long time. Together, they stepped forward. The door creaked open, heavy and reluctant, but it opened. Dust and old memories flooded out into the cold morning light, but so did something else, something newer, cleaner. Hope. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling the weight of it all, the years, the fights, the loneliness, the small victories that no one else had seen. And she thought, this is what wealth is for. Not just to be hoarded or displayed, but to be shared. To rebuild what the world tried to break. As she crossed the threshold, she felt it deep in her bones. She hadn't just changed her own story. She was rewriting the whole damn book.